that we won't go over in much detail. But for example, you have session variables, and you have client variables, you have URL variables and form variables, and those are kind of examples of scopes. The nice thing from the non-programmer perspective is that you can access them through their fully qualified scope names, or you can just choose not to use a scope at all, and a lot of them will resolve anyway. Hash foo and hash url.foo in many instances will reference the same variable, which is the foo parameter coming in on the query string in a GET request. They won't always be the same, but they will sometimes be the same. And we'll get into search order in a couple slides. I'm going to skip over this. Some of these slides are very dense, just to put the information in there, but I won't go into too much detail. But the idea here is that, again, you have multiple ways, even though there's a scope defined, in this case the query scope, which is a temporary scope, they still let you access these variables in two different ways. So you can do call one, or query.call1, and that's the result of a database query that's going on there. But they don't require you to use any specific syntax, because it just kind of figures out as it goes and it tries to guess which scope that you actually meant. And maybe it'll get it right, maybe it won't. These are all the scopes. Again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all these, but the slides will be published. And this is all part of the ColdFusion Adobe documentation, so you can get that anywhere. Variable types. Again, there aren't really that many real types in ColdFusion. Most of it is dynamically typed. All of these supposed actual types are not really types. They're mostly just strings with regexes that get validated at runtime. There are a few data types that actually are real types. So arrays are actually different from strings. Queries are used as a special data type for database queries. And so on. But for the most part, just about everything is a string. So it's just something to be aware of as you're looking through this. There's no strict typing in the language. ColdFusion expressions. You saw some of this in the previous example when I was talking about the variable scopes. Anytime you see something where it's surrounded by hash marks, that's a ColdFusion expression, and it's going to be evaluated in the context of the ColdFusion language. So you have automatic interpolation of anything inside certain tags. So CF output is used to write stuff to the screen. CF loop is the construct that allows you to create a loop inside a CF page. You have dynamic scoping, making analysis even more difficult when you have things like this. So the first CF set over there sets the variable foo to the value bar. The second one looks at what's in the variable foo, and then essentially evals that, and then sets that to whatever is in the variable bar. So you can have these complex expression evaluations that create confusion as you're trying to read through the code and figure out what it's actually doing. And you have to really pay attention to when something is an expression or when it's not. And then in addition to all the expression evaluation, the dynamic scoping, the dynamic typing, you have the equivalent of eval, which if you've ever done auditing of JavaScript or PHP or any interpreted language that gives you eval-like functionality, you know how ugly that can get when it comes to, again, figuring out what is actually going to happen at runtime. Okay, so you're a code reviewer, you're a developer, you're a pen tester, you have access to some ColdFusion code, and you want to start figuring out where the dangerous things are happening. Number one, first thing you always do, right, is look for untrusted data. Untrusted data is the key to finding things like cross-site scripting and SQL injection and command injection and really any type of injection vulnerability. But it comes into play with some of the other types of vulnerabilities as well. You need to understand which things the user can control and which things they can't. So anything where a variable is being accessed in any of the scopes at the top, so the URL scope, the form scope, the cookie scope, I imagine those things are probably pretty self-explanatory where they're coming from. But the flash scope, that's the flash remoting gateway. CGI scope is similar to the CGI scope in other web platforms, except that in ColdFusion, the user can actually alter quite a few more of those variables than they can in other platforms. Some session variables will be tainted or user controlled, depending on the application logic. So none of them are implicitly tainted, but usually the application will take some things that come from the user and store them in the session, so you have to keep track of which ones those are. Anything in the client scope, I've got a slide on this later, but client scope variables persist across sessions, and they may contain tainted data depending on, again, what the application does. And then finally, CF function arguments. Those are the user-defined functions I referred to earlier, and I've got a slide on that. A few slides on cross-site scripting because it's just the most common vulnerability, and there's some unique things about ColdFusion that are worth pointing out. In terms of defense, one thing that people often do by mistake or just not quite understanding how it works is using this attribute called script protect. And this is something that can be applied at the page level or at the application level in ColdFusion. And what it does is anytime it sees the user supply a piece of data that contains open bracket script or open bracket object, it replaces that on the fly with open bracket invalid tag. And it's trying to do a blacklist style approach to prevent cross-site scripting from being injected. So it blocks the most basic attack strings. If your attack string happens to start with one of those tags, and there are a few others that it checks for, but there's only about 3 or 4 strings. So here's an example. You have CF application, you turn script protect on, and then you have an output tag that says you typed url.foo. It just takes the foo parameter from the query string and prints it out. This open script is replaced with invalid tag. Just trivial to circumvent. There's like a million different ways to do it, and you can just put it inside something that doesn't require a script tag, and then it just runs. So it's, I won't say totally useless. I mean, it doesn't hurt, but it really doesn't help. It shouldn't be thought of as the defense to use. Similar to ASP.NET, where you're not supposed to use validate request for cross-site scripting protection, where it doesn't hurt you, but it's not really going to protect you in the majority of the cases. If you really want to edit the blacklist, there's an XML file that you can add stuff to, and I've seen examples of people trying to do that. HTML edit format is a built-in function that can be used to do HTML encoding. HTML code format does the same thing. Unfortunately, these only encode 4 characters, open, close bracket, double quote, and ampersand. So there's some examples of cases where you might use HTML edit format on a user-supplied untrusted variable and still have cross-site scripting, because it does not account for single quotes and it does not account for no quotes. Nor does it account for something that's already in a JavaScript block. If you've read the OWASP cross-site scripting prevention cheat sheet, then you understand that cross-site scripting prevention is contextual and needs to be applied differently depending on the context of where the untrusted data is being used. They have another function called XML format, which does also encode single quotes in addition to those other 4 characters, but it still won't prevent cross-site scripting if you're inside a JavaScript block. It's going to be generally a better encoding function to use, though, than HTML edit format. And it's very non-intuitive because developers will think, well, why would I be using XML format? I'm not doing XML. But there it is. It works better. Default error pages provide some additional risks. So let's say you're being smart and you're saying, well, this count parameter on the URL is supposed to be a number. So before I output it, let me cast it to an int, or use one of these other functions that are provided to cast something untrusted to an int or a different data type like a Boolean. Well, let's say you do that. Somebody provides bracket script or some non-integer as the query string parameter. Oops. So you'll get a default error page, and the default error page will say the value, whatever they typed, cannot be converted to a number, and that creates cross-site scripting. Script protect is enabled by default on these error pages, but again, we saw that was pretty useless if they just picked the right error string, injection string. So, this is an instance where it looks like the developer is doing the right thing. It looks like they're doing the casting, but depending on how they have the application set up, it may actually make the situation just as bad if they've got the error page turned on. So you can set up your own custom error pages. You can set a site-wide error page that does not use the default, but you can still make mistakes doing that. If you do that, you use a CF error tag, and it says, anytime an error is thrown, use this template, errorhandler.cfm, and display that instead of the default error page. And when that happens, when the errorhandler.cfm is loaded, you have access to this error object that's generated by ColdFusion. And it helps, provides diagnostic information and other information that you can print on the screen that says why the error happened. Well, if you happen to output two of those member fields, diagnostics or message, you will create cross-site scripting. Same for if you use the exception handling try-catch mechanism, and you catch the exception, but then you print out the reason for the exception, which is stored in cfcatch.message, that will create cross-site scripting. So these are all things to watch out for that are not very well documented that could create additional risk with respect to cross-site scripting. This is a slide that's pretty much on every ColdFusion security presentation I've seen out there, but I needed to include it anyway. You can do ad hoc queries using CF query, and you can do parameterized queries using CF query param. If you see somebody doing a query without using CF query param, that's a potential SQL injection. One interesting thing that ColdFusion does with the CF query tag is that any parameter that's put into single quotes, and so any expression that's in single quotes, like title search, will automatically be single quote escaped. So it's probably not going to be possible to escape out of that and inject into that field. But if you have a field that's not single quoted, such as page ID, then that one is going to be escapable or injectable because you don't need to escape out of the single quotes because there are none. So that's something to watch out for. When I did a lot of pen testing, and I was pen testing ColdFusion applications, that was the first thing you look for. You look for numeric fields, because almost always you'd be able to inject into those because the developer wouldn't put any quotes around it. And you have the same thing for stored procedures. You have CF stored proc and CF proc param, which is the stored procedure equivalent to bind parameters. For unknown reasons, if you look at the documentation, the CF SQL type attribute, which is where you tell it what type of bind parameter to use, is an optional attribute. I don't know why it's an optional attribute, because that's the whole point. But if you would leave it off, it'll try and guess what you wanted to bind it as, and it'll still work. I'm not going to talk about most of the other OWASP-specific vulnerabilities, the OWASP top 10 vulnerabilities, because there's not that much unique in what ColdFusion does. Instead, I'd rather spend the time talking about the interesting stuff around ColdFusion variables and scoping and undefined and unscoped variables. There's some dangerous tags that also come into play with ColdFusion, but all this is available in the developer documentation. We talked about UDS before and how they're used for web services and for anything that wants to be accessible by other ColdFusion pages. So if you set the access category to remote when you're defining that function, that means that it can be called directly over the URL. You just pass in the method name and the arguments all in the URL, and that can be called. So if somebody is writing a user-defined function that's intended to be used only directly by the application code, but that they set the access level to remote, and that function happens to be doing something sensitive, then basically anybody could just request it directly over the web, bypassing the page that was supposed to be calling it. So that's a authorization issue to look out for if you're auditing. By default, it'll be access equals public, which allows other pages to call it, but not to be called remotely. Okay, coming back to scoping, which we talked about earlier. If you use a variable name without a scope prefix, like #foo from my earlier example, what ColdFusion will do is it'll go through this checklist of all the different scopes that it's aware of, and it will see if it can find something called foo in those different scopes. And if it does, it'll stop and use that one. There's the search order. So it'll start with the local variables, and then it'll go through the CGI space, the URL space, form space, cookie, and client. So if you're looking at code and you have, you're looking at sets and gets of different variable access,